You are listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, a weekly shortwave radio program and online podcast dedicated to uncensored, politically incorrect biblical teaching. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. And now the broadcast.
Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. I'm your host, Matthew Dyer, and we're broadcasting around the world on shortwave radio and over the internet at our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries, over on YouTube, as well as Spotify and TuneIn and BitChute, and over at kingdomradioonline.com. And if you'd like to learn more about this ministry, you can go to our website, christianamericaministries.org. And if you're listening to us on shortwave radio this evening, we would love a reception report. Those help out a great deal. And you can do that by going to our website and just going to the contact page and saying, hey, I'm listening on such and such frequency at such and such time, and give us the state or the country that you're in. And if you do that, if you would like, you can give us your mailing address, and we will send you a free copy of one of my books, free of charge, just as a thank you for taking the time to send us a reception report. Those help out. Unlike over on the internet with Spotify or YouTube, I can't look at an algorithm and see how many people are listening. And when we broadcast on radio, we're doing it the old-fashioned way, so it helps to know who's listening and what our reach is. In this radio broadcast this evening, we're going to be talking about God's law. And this is a very important subject, one that cannot be preached on enough. And there's so many different aspects to touch on it, and we're going to be touching on one of those aspects this evening. And this is a very important subject, especially with the state of our nation and the world that we live in today, and how far morality has fallen from the lives of professing Christians and families, and how so many of them have become what we call antinomian. They have abandoned God's law and become an anti-law. Basically, they're living in spiritual anarchy, and they're living a life of, to summarize it, a life of sin. And many professing Christians don't even know the difference between sin and transgressing God's law. Well, let me give you a spoiler alert here. There is no difference. It's the same thing. But many Christians will say that sin is totally different than God's law and transgressing God's law. Well, that's not true. And we'll look at that here in this broadcast. But right now, in America, and the whole world for that matter, I think we're at a huge turning point. And there's a lot of people waking up to a lot of different truths right now. And that's good. It's great. I mean, there's things being talked about now that you would not have heard 30 years ago on the mainstream media. When I say mainstream media, I mean just on popular podcasts and things like that, and some of the media that we use today and being talked about as common today it wasn't 30 years ago. But right now, we don't need to forget that as Christians, we need to turn back to God's law as our standard of living. And that will make the difference in our country, in the lives of our families. And many people may accuse me of being, an old legalist or something like that for talking like that. But if you read throughout the Bible, Israel was punished and was cursed when they quit following God's law. And it's interesting because you can look at those curses and you can look at how those curses were upon Israel. And you can look, for example, at America today, and you can see the curses that are on America right now, and the sins, the transgressions of God's law that are connected to those curses. Just read Deuteronomy 28. I preached a sermon on that back in October at our annual Bible conference over in Arkansas on that exact subject, on how God's laws are being broken, so we have curses in America today. And I know many people are very excited that about President Trump, and he's going to fix everything. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you this, and you can mark it down. It's not a prophecy or anything like that, but it is a fact that this nation, America, will not become great again. It won't become better. It won't become blessed unless we turn back and follow God's law. Now, no amount of tariffs or whoever's in the White House is going to change that. Things may get better at the gas pump, or the price of eggs may go down, or they may go up. But the morality of our nation, and it is dropped so low in such a short amount of time, that will not get better unless we turn back to God's law. And we need to remember that. But there's a lot of professing Christians out there that think that God's law came into existence at Mount Sinai and then existed from Mount Sinai to the cross, and then when Jesus died on the cross, the laws of God went away. So they came into existence at Mount Sinai and they went away at the cross, is how many people believe. And today we don't have any law to live by. We don't have any standard to live by because we are saved by grace. Well, I don't doubt that. I don't deny that, I should say. We are saved by grace through faith in Christ. We are. We're justified by that. We're not saved by the works of the law. If you want to learn more about that, I preached a sermon on that just here recently on justification, and then the week after that on sanctification. And very important subjects. But a lot of people think that since you are justified by faith, that you're to live a lawless life. Well, I would question whether a person that says they're saved and live a life of sin and anarchy and lawlessness, I would really question whether or not they are saved and they truly are justified. But that's between them and God. But I would question whether they really are, because a person that is truly justified, truly saved, they will want to do the will of God. They will want to follow God and do what He wants them to do because they are justified. And that's a huge difference from living a lawless life, like we see so many Christians today that they ignore God's law. They throw it out. They nail it to the cross. And I've had professing Christians tell me that the 10 Commandments, things like thou shalt not murder, are done away with. That there's no longer any sin. And I've asked them point blank when they tell me that, what about murder? And no, murder is not a sin. Now that's a big issue. Because remember, it was Jesus that said, the very first words that He said when He started His ministry after His baptism was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Well, repent, it means change, to change a way of life, to turn away from something, to change your course. There's many ways we can rephrase it. And then even, the woman caught in adultery, what did Jesus tell her? Well, go and sin no more. He didn't deny she sinned. The reason she wasn't stoned to death is because there wasn't witnesses, which is what 2 or 3 witnesses, which was what the law of God commanded. But He said to repent, and then He said to go and sin no more. Well, that didn't change upon the cross when He died for our sins. We are not to sin. We are not to transgress the law. And there's many people, like I was saying before, that think that this law came into existence at Mount Sinai, and then it went out of existence at the cross, and now it's all right to murder, steal, and commit adultery and other sexual sins or whatever, because, well, we're saved through grace. So if we do these things, it's all right. Just, and that's not the life that we're supposed to be living. We as Christians are to use God's law as a standard of living. No, it doesn't save us, but that is our standard of living. That is the way of life that we are to live by, is through God's law, what He has given us. Jesus did not die on the cross for us to sin. He died for our sins. But many Christians, professing Christians, teach that Jesus died on the cross for us to commit sin. And that's not biblical. That's not right. That's not even Christian to think that. So in this broadcast, I want to look at the subject of whether or not God's law was in existence before Moses. Because if it was in existence before Moses, and then it was in existence during the Old Covenant after the Mount Sinai, then that means that it is in existence in the New Covenant after the cross. Now, if you read, this is kind of a very elementary subject. If you read about the New Covenant in Jeremiah 31, you'll know that there is a law in the New Covenant. It says it right there when it's speaking of the New Covenant. And it speaks about the law being written on our heart. Well, that is a law. And it's interesting. In the Hebrew, in Jeremiah 31, that word there, law, is the word Torah, which is used all throughout the Old Testament for law, for God's law. So let's go ahead and let's look at this idea of God's law, what we can call the morality of God, being in existence before Moses, and how it didn't come into existence at Mount Sinai, that God's morality was intact long before Moses was even born. And if you really think about it, to say that God's morality wasn't, that He thought murder was all right, and adultery and sodomy and things like that before Mount Sinai is really twisted, because that means God's morality changes, from age to age. Now that's very schizophrenic. We don't want God to be that way. We want Him to see and be just all throughout the ages. If He thought sodomy was wrong during the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, and He thought it was wrong during the Old Covenant, we want Him to think it's wrong and a sin and a transgression during the New Covenant, because we don't want Him to change His mind all the time. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So let's go ahead and let's turn to Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. And let's start reading from there on. It says here, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. And when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth. And from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. End quote. Now, let me ask you this question. Did Cain know that killing his brother was bad? Or we could say, did he know that it was a transgression of God's law? Did he know that God would think that it was something that he was going to get in trouble with? Now, if he didn't know it was wrong, why did he try to outsmart God about not being his brother's keeper? He kind of smarted off there to the mouth to God. And why did he attempt to hide it? Why did he lie to God if he thought that it was, if he didn't know better? Well, if you read the story, he clearly knew that he had done something wrong, and he was trying to hide from God. Now, I'm not saying he was very intelligent. I mean, obviously, he's not very smart. But then again, we have Christians today that try to hide their sin from God too. And that's not very smart. I mean, we as fallen men and women, we can go out of the way to try to justify our sin. I think everybody listening to this broadcast knows what I'm talking about. Well, I think we've all tried to justify something that we knew was wrong. Now, some may say concerning the story of Cain, well, yeah, but God's moral law, which all God's laws are moral, found in the Ten Commandments and their statutes and judgments that explain those commandments, would have put him to death, speaking of Cain, and not cast him away and marked him like God did. And, that is 100% correct. The law does teach that, if someone murders, that they're to be put to death. That God's law teaches capital punishment. But we need to understand this, what else God's law teaches. And that's in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6, where it says this, "And at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death." End quote. Now, was there 2 or 3 witnesses to Abel's murder? No, the text doesn't say that. In fact, it seems there was no witnesses other than God himself. So God could have, in his morality, sentenced judgment on him and put him to death, made him fall over or whatever. But in that way, I guess God can do whatever he wants. But the law calls for 2 or 3 witnesses, so he just sent him away. And Cain's punishment was unique in that God didn't break his own law and put him to death, or tell Adam to put Cain to death, because there wasn't 2 or 3 witnesses in that, and it was just because of that. Now let's turn to Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 through 5, and it says this. "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And God said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, and yet his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. When the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, they bare children of them. To the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that their imagination of thoughts in his heart was only evil continually." Verse 11 then says, if you want to go down to there, it says, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." Now, there's so much more that can be said in this passage, and I don't want to get into it, but I do want to point out a few details here. Most people interpret this passage as being fallen angels mating with women. I don't necessarily believe that. I think there's more going on in this passage than exactly that. But we know that some kind of adultery, some kind of sexual sin was committed in this verse. And if there was no law given before Mount Sinai, then how would men or whoever know what was wrong, what was right? How could the earth be corrupt if there was no measuring stick to measure corruption? Now realize there's people out there that teach that God's morality hadn't even come into existence yet. But here we have punishment being dealt. And we clearly see God's law and God's morality being played out here in this passage and elsewhere. And that shows us that God's law was in effect as in that violence and corruption and some kind of sexual sin going on here, that God was displeased with them. Now let's move to Genesis chapter 7, verse 1 through 2. And it says here, And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house unto the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7, the male and his female, and the beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Now, as we just read in Genesis chapter 6, we have this corruption here going on here, this sin. We have the earth and being corrupted, and we know that the actual ground wasn't corrupted, but it's actually speaking of what's in the earth. And now we have the judgment being laid out and given to Moses, where we know the flood came upon the land. And it says here, Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7, the male and his female, and of the beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Now, how did Noah know what a clean and unclean animal was, if there was not already a law of God that told him that? Now, I'm not saying the law of God was written down. In fact, more than likely, at least from what I understand, it was probably given verbally from Adam on down to Noah. So when God gave these instructions, he knew what an unclean animal was. He knew what a clean one was. It wasn't codified until Mount Sinai, but how did Noah know what the difference was if there was no law before that? Now, a lot of people teach that clean and unclean animals didn't even come into existence until Mount Sinai with the ritual laws and so forth and so on, is how they'll put it. And no, that's not true. Even Noah knew what an unclean animal was. And he separated them from the clean and unclean. So that is to be taken into consideration. Now, I know that when it comes into the dietary laws and eating clean and unclean animals, that's a loaded subject. We've talked about that on the broadcast before. I don't believe in eating unclean animals. In fact, my entire life, my family has kept what is known as the biblical food laws, not as a way of earning salvation or anything like that, but a way of keeping God's law, his moral law, what he's given us and told us not to do. And the main reason for doing that is because God said to do it. And the secondary reason is there's health benefits to it as well. And we've talked about that several times on the broadcast. But Noah would have done the same thing. He knew the difference. Now let's look at Genesis chapter 9, verse 18 through 25. And it says here, And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backwards and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backwards, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall be he be unto his brethren. End quote. Now, what happened in this verse here was sexual sin towards Noah's wife. Now, at first glance, it sounds like that Ham just saw his father naked, but that is not what is going on here. Nowhere in Scripture is just stumbling upon your father naked, or maybe going around the corner while he's relieving himself, and you see him naked. Is that ever classified as a sin? It's not. I mean, you can look through God's law. Never is it classified in that way. But what this is here, this term, uncover your father's nakedness, What that is a Hebrew idiom for having sexual relations with someone that you're not supposed to. And in the context of this, it's having sexual relations with somebody that, speaking of his father, it would be Noah's wife. Now, whether this was Ham's mother or maybe another wife, we really don't know. But if you notice, he curses Ham's son. Now, it is understood that Canaan is the product of this looking upon your father's nakedness. So he's a product of incest through this relationship here. And that's why Noah cursed Canaan, because he's of incest. And we can look at Leviticus chapter 18, verse 6 through 8, where it says this, to clarify what this idiom that's being used. Quote, "None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of thy father, or the nakedness of thy mother, shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness." End quote. Now, this law in Leviticus was given after Moses. Now, why would Noah have a problem with this action if there was no moral law in place? So, if what we have here in Genesis with Noah, if we have some kind of incestual relationship going on here, why would Noah think there was anything wrong with it if there was no law in place? Now, of course, you all are saying, well, of course he knows there's something wrong with it. Yes, that's my point. Because there's some law that is God's law, not some law. God's morality is found in the earth at this time before Mount Sinai. No one would know what anything was right or wrong. If these were just lawless people, then why would Ham know any better? How would he know incest was against God's law and God's plan? Well, he wouldn't. But it was. It was in the land. It was understood. It's passed down from Adam, is what I believe. Now let's look at Genesis chapter 18, verse 20 through 33. Let's read it. It says here, "And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me. If not, I will know. And the men turned their face from thence and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure, there be 50 righteous within the city. Will thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous, for there are in? That be far from thee to do after this manner, and to slay the righteous with the wicked? And that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sake. And Abraham answered and said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which I am but dust and ashes. But peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, If I find there 45, I will not destroy the city, or not destroy it. And he spake unto him yet again, and said, Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. Verse 30. And he said unto him, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak, peradventure there shall 30 be found there. And he said, I will not do it, if I find 30 there. And he said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once, peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way, And as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place, end quote. Now, think here. Now, if there is no law given yet at this point in history, no morality given to man, what are we to think about the terms wicked and righteous in this whole back and forth with God and Abraham here? I mean, obviously, Abraham is measuring the difference of righteous people and wicked people with some kind of measuring stick. I mean, think about it here. We all know that there's some kind of morality being spoken about here, God's morality. Now, the word for righteous here is the Hebrew word sadik, and it means just, righteous, lawful. Now, the word for wicked in this passage is the Hebrew word rasha, and means morally wrong, an actively bad person, condemned, guilty, an ungodly person. It pretty much means the opposite of righteous. Now, we all know that Sodom and Gomorrah was overrun with sodomy, which is homosexuality, as well as a bunch of other sexual sins as well, I have no doubt, and violence, and there's no telling what. It was overrun with sin, particularly sodomy, and which is a type of adultery. And usually when that sin has taken place in a society, there's a lot of other things going on too. So it's not just sodomy. But notice what is said here in verse 20, the very first verse that we read here. It says here, "And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous." Now, what is sin? Now, this is pretty elementary, but think about it here. If we go over to the New Testament and we read in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, this is what it says sin is. Quote, "Whoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law." The New American Standard puts it this way: "Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness." If there is no law, there is no sin. So we know for a fact that there is a law during the days of Sodom and Gomorrah because there is sin. And according to this passage here, it was very grievous. So if there was no moral law of God around, then why would anyone, think about this too. You know, God's punishment on Sodom and Gomorrah was pretty harsh. We'll read about that here in a minute. If there wasn't any law, God was very hot-headed, if you think about it, for getting mad at these men and women down in Sodom, committing the lust they were, when there was no law in the world to show them right or wrong. I mean, he just lit them up. All because they didn't know right or wrong because he hadn't told them yet, is how many professing Christians will teach it. But that's not the case. Noah knew what righteousness was and wickedness was. Abraham here talking to God knew the difference. Now, let's look at Genesis chapter 19, verse 24 through 25. And this is what happened. "Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground." He destroyed it. Because of what? Because of their sin. Because of their transgressions against his law, which had to have been in existence during those days for him to do such a thing. Do you think God would have destroyed these people if no one in the world, no one, had any knowledge of right or wrong? I don't think he would have. But his law was already out there. It was in the land. It was known, right and wrong. People knew that sodomy was wrong, but they did it anyway. Now let's look at Genesis chapter 26, verse 4 through 5. It says this, speaking of Abraham. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thee seed in all these countries. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my law. End quote. Now that right there, we really could sum this whole topic up just with those two verses there, one verse. If there was no law of God before Mount Sinai, how could Abraham obey his voice, his charge, my commandments, his commandments right there, his statutes and his laws? How could that even happen? What law was Abraham keeping? What statutes was he keeping? It sounds like Abraham had a moral law that he was living by, that was around long before Moses. One that could be used to differ between what was righteous and what was wicked. Now let's go to Genesis chapter 35, verse 1 through 4, speaking of Jacob. And it says here, And God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God, that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. And then Jacob said unto his household, and to all that were there with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments, and let us arise and go up to Bethel. And I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. End quote. Now from this reading here, reading this passage, we see that Jacob seemed to have understood the first and second commandment of the 10 Commandments, that God was to be his only head, ruler, judge, lawgiver, only God. Now remember, the very first commandment was, Thou shalt have no other gods before me, no other Elohim, no other ruler, no other God, deity. And then it says, Thou shalt not have unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generations of them that hate me. That's Exodus chapter 20, verse 3 through 5. It would seem from this passage in Genesis chapter 35, 1 through 4, that Jacob understood that commandment. It just wasn't codified yet, wasn't written down yet, but he understood it. We can also see with Adam and Eve that they broke the first commandment by placing themselves above God. The moment they took the commandment of God and they did as they saw was right in their own eyes, they dethroned God in their mind and put themselves upon that throne. This was breaking the first commandment. They then broke the second commandment by idolizing the forbidden fruit. Now here in America, we've done the same thing. When we throw away God's law and replace it with what? With man's law. Whether it be the Constitution, our own morality that we make up, or whatever, it doesn't matter. When we take God's morality and we replace it with anything else. At that moment in time, we have broken the first commandment by finding another Elohim, another God, and serving him. Because God's law is perfect. We don't need to find another law to follow. It's God's law. Now, we know this from Psalm 19, 7 through 11, where it says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord, or the reverence of the Lord, is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is thy servant warned, and in keeping of them there is great reward." And that's speaking of God's law. It's perfect. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if God's law is perfect, any other law is imperfect and corrupt and wrong. Because there's only one lawgiver. And we read about this in James, the book of James, in the New Testament, chapter 4, verse 12, where it says, "There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you judging your neighbor?" End quote. That is pretty clear. There's only one lawgiver. Now, the fourth commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 says this: "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." End quote. Now, this is an interesting verse that it starts out with remember. Now, it doesn't do that in any other commandment, which implies that it's easy to forget the Sabbath. And many people will argue over which day the Sabbath is. That is a loaded subject. I think keeping the Sabbath, as in keeping one day out of 7, and doing that properly, is much more important than squabbling over which day you do it on. Now, a lot of people will disagree with me on that, but I know people who do Saturday Sabbath. I know people who do Sunday Sabbath. I know people who do lunar Sabbath. I know people who do solar Sabbath. And they all, not all of them, but they all think they're right. They all are very passionate about what they believe in. And many of them, not all of them, like to argue with one another and make the point that, well, such and so over there, they say they keep Sabbath, but they don't. They don't keep Sabbath. They're Sabbath breakers because they keep it on Sunday or Friday, and I keep it on Saturday, or whatever the case may be. And I'm not saying there isn't a right or wrong answer to what day is proper. There's good arguments on several different positions on the subject. My point is, with bringing that up, because I know I'll get mail on it, I think it's more important to keep the Sabbath properly than to worry about what day you're keeping it on. Because I know some people that are very adamant about what day they keep it on, but they don't keep the Sabbath on that day that they're very adamant about. They don't make it holy. They don't make it stand out among the other 6. So that's all I just wanted to say to give that clarifying point. But I do want to point out that we have the Sabbath, the 7th day, being pointed out in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. And it says here, "And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." End quote. Now, this is when the Sabbath was sanctified and made holy. That was a law of God before Moses. Then in Exodus chapter 16, verse 23 through 28, we see Moses reminding the Israelites to keep the Sabbath before Mount Sinai. Listen to this. "And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and seeth that ye will seeth, and that which remaineth overlay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. 6 days ye shall gather it. But on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? End quote. Now, obviously, he's not speaking of, in verse 28 says, And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? This is before Mount Sinai. Now keep in mind that. This is when they're in the wilderness on their way there. The Israelites were clearly keeping a weekly Sabbath at this moment in time. And it was consecrated, it was sanctified way back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. I imagine Adam and Noah and Jacob and all them and Abraham were doing the same thing because it was part of the law. Now, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, the fifth commandment says here, Honor your father and your mother. If we look at Isaac, he did not want his sons to take a wife from a forbidden lineage of the Canaanites. He wanted them to obey the command of kind after kind. He didn't want them to commit the sin of miscegenation, and that's what it was. And we all know that Esau dishonored his parents by doing and rejecting and his birthright and basically spitting on it by doing the exact opposite. But we see Jacob honoring his parents in Genesis chapter 28, verse 6 through 7, when it says this. When Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan to take him a wife from thence, and that he has blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. And that Jacob obeyed his father and his mother and was gone to Padan. End quote. He was honoring his father and his mother by doing exactly what they had commanded him to do, by taking a wife of his own kindred. We know Esau did the exact opposite, and it displeased him. It was a grief to his mother and father because of that. There was a law of honoring your father and mother there. The seventh commandment says, Thou shalt not commit adultery, Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. And in this passage here, we've talked about it before, adultery is a blanket term. Yes, it does apply for a husband and wife cheating on one another, as we would say in today's language. That is included, and that is what it's mainly used for in the Scriptures. But adultery is a blanket term for any sexual sin. And this has been understood for hundreds and thousands of years. It falls under fornication. Fornication falls under adultery. Theologians like John Calvin and such have all taught on this, and it's been understood. So the sin of homosexuality and bestiality and marrying into forbidden lineages, those would fall under the Ten Commandment, in the Ten Commandments, under Thou shalt not commit adultery. But we see in Genesis chapter 39, 7 through 9, with Joseph and Potiphar's wife, when she tried to seduce him, and he refused, because she wanted him to sleep with him, and he refused, and then things got bad for Joseph because of that, because then Potiphar's wife went and lied to her husband, and he got thrown in jail because of it. But he got blessed for it later on. Now ask this question, excuse me. How did Joseph know that sleeping with his master's wife was bad? If there was no moral law of God prior to this event, how would he think that there was anything wrong with it? How would he, I mean, it was adultery. Let's read here, Genesis chapter 39, verse 7 through 9. It says here, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath into my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness in sin against God?" End quote. Joseph called this act wickedness and sin. Remember, 1 John 3:4, a sin is a transgression of God's law. Joseph clearly knew that. He understood that this was a wickedness and a sin. He understood this was adultery, and it was wrong. The 8th commandment we see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, thou shalt not steal. We see this pop up in Genesis 44 when Joseph framed his brother for stealing the silver cup. And the 9th commandment in Exodus 20, verse 16, thou shalt not bear false witness. We clearly see this, I forgot to mention it earlier, with Cain and his brother's keeper comment to God in Genesis 4. He was not being upfront with God. He was bearing false witness. He was lying. He was trying to deceive God because he knew what he was doing was wrong. And you also have the 10th commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, you shall not covet. You can see that with Adam and Eve. They clearly coveted what was not theirs. They coveted the fruit that they were told not to eat. And they coveted it before the commandments of God, and they sinned because of it. They wanted something that they were not allowed to have. That's coveting. And it led to sin. Now, there's many other proofs to God's law being in existence before Mount Sinai. This was kind of just in a nutshell. Some notes I had scratched down to do this message. I preached 2 sermons on this subject a couple of years ago. I think about 3 years ago. You can find them on YouTube. I think they're titled God's Law Before Moses, Part 1 and 2. Because it's clearly seen throughout the book of Genesis and the early part of Exodus, the moral law of God was clearly given to these people. And I think it was clearly given to Adam and then passed down over the years throughout his descendants. And then at Mount Sinai, it was just codified. It was written down. And thank God it was. Now, the reason this is important is because it is a key to understanding why God's law today are not done away with, and how they are for us to use today as a standard of living, not for salvation, but as a standard of living, a form of sanctification to live by. And Christians need to understand that. And I'll say it again, none of this is to say that Christians are under the law as they were in the Israelites during the Old Covenant. The Bible is very clear that the New Covenant Christians are not under the law, but under grace. Romans 6:14. We are no longer required to keep the law perfectly as a way of salvation, a way of righteousness. And we're saved by grace, but that doesn't mean that we are to live lawless lives and not try to do our best and obey God's law as a form of sanctification, a setting apart. And we need that more now than ever. The world today is in a constant state of sin and filth. And we're being punished because of it. We're being spanked by God because we have refused to follow God's law and do as He commanded. And we need to realize that as Christian Israel. that we need to be the moral light of the world. We need to be the moral salt of the earth. Now, those passages in the book of Matthew, when Jesus is saying that you need to be the salt of the earth, well, salt holds back corruption. Now, think about the language used during the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, during the story before the flood, how the earth was corrupted. Well, we know it wasn't talking about the ground. It was talking about what man was doing. We need to be, as Christian Israel, the salt that holds back corruption, that holds back the rot. And we do that by following the perfect law, Psalm 19. Now, if God's law is perfect, then that means everything else that is not God's law is imperfect. And we need to be the light of the world to our brethren. We need to be seen being the moral people that we were meant to be. And make a difference. And hey, I understand. The nation and the world is so corrupt, it can be a little overwhelming. Well, we need to start on our person, in our personal lives first, then our family, and then our community, and work outwards. If we do that, we'll make a bigger difference than most people realize. But a lot of people think they want to try to go take on Washington, D.C. or the entire nation when they don't even have their own lives put in order. We need to work on ourselves and our family and our community. And when I say community, I'm speaking of our ecclesia, our local assembly. And if you don't have one of those, well, work towards getting one. That's very important. And I plan on talking about that in an upcoming broadcast about how we as Christian Israel, particularly the men, the heads of households, need to take this forsake not the assembly very seriously. Just a preview of an upcoming broadcast. Maybe next week, maybe not. But I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. I kind of threw this together at last minute. I just had some things on my heart that I wanted to talk about concerning God's law, and I was thinking about how it did exist before Moses, and how so many Christians that teach it didn't, just haven't read their Bible. So I hope that you enjoyed this broadcast and it was edifying to you. And for those just now listening, you're listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, and we've just been talking about God's law and how it was in existence before Mount Sinai. And if you want to learn more about this ministry, you can go to ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. And if you're listening to us on Shortwave Radio, we would love to get a reception report from you. You can go to our website and go to our contact page and just send us a message and say, hey, I listened to you on such and such frequency at such and such time, and let us know what state or country that you're in. It helps out a great deal. And if you send us your mailing address, we'll send you a free copy of one of my books just as a thank you for taking the time to send in that reception report. Well, I've been your host, Matthew Dyer. You've been listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Come back next week for another broadcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. If you are blessed by this outreach ministry, please consider going to www.christianamericaministries.org to our contact page and donating to our radio ministry to help keep this program on the air. We appreciate your support.
You have been listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Come back next week on Shortwave Radio or on the internet for our next broadcast. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. Thank you for listening.